What happens when a gang of criminals targets a black woman at a cafe, thinking she is an easy target to rob, only to find out she was waiting on her Navy SEAL father? Watch as the seasoned veteran fights back against the gang, saving his daughter and risking it all to keep her safe. The city cafe was alive with its usual late afternoon buzz. Angela Parker sat outside, savoring the warmth of the sun on her skin. Her cappuccino sat untouched on the table, a perfect swirl of foam catching the light. She tapped away on her phone, scrolling through emails and half paying attention to the lively hum of the street. She didn't notice the three men right away. Their laughter blended into the background, a low, persistent noise cutting through the clinking of cups and occasional bursts of conversation. Only when their voices grew louder and closer did Angela glance up. Three men strolled down the sidewalk, their movements relaxed but deliberate. One of them, tall and wiry, led the way, his smirk as sharp as the way his eyes scanned the street. His companions, a blond man with a scar on his jaw and a stocky figure wearing a hoodie, followed slightly behind, chuckling at something he'd said. Angela's gaze flicked back to her phone. She wasn't worried. Not yet. The cafe was busy, the patio filled with people. Families, couples, groups of friends. She wasn't alone, she told herself. Still, her hands felt oddly tense as she scrolled. The sound of chairs scraping made her look up again. The three men had stopped, standing near her table. The tall one's grin widened as he glanced at her, then at the empty chairs around her. "Nice day, isn't it?" he said casually, his tone light, almost friendly. Angela nodded faintly, her lips pressed into a tight smile. She didn't respond, hoping they'd take the hint and move on. But they didn't. "Mind if we sit?" he asked, already pulling out a chair. Before Angela could reply, the blonde one laughed. "Man, don't ask her. She doesn't care." The words stung more than they should have. Angela's eyes darted to the cafe, searching for a waiter, someone who might notice what was happening. "Relax," the tall one said, leaning back in the chair he'd claimed. "We're just being friendly." "Right, guys?" Angela forced a polite smile. Her gut told her to stay calm, to avoid provoking them, even as unease curled tighter in her stomach. "We'll just hang out here for a bit," the blond man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You don't mind, do you?" Angela's pulse quickened. She didn't answer. Angela's fingers tightened around her coffee cup as the leader, Greg, leaned back in his chair. The smirk plastered on his face was as unnerving as his gaze, which roamed across her belongings like he was appraising a prize. His two friends flanked him, their expressions equally smug, as if the entire cafe patio belonged to them. "You don't look like you belong around here," Greg said, his voice light, but laced with a mocking edge. "What brings you to this side of town?" Angela hesitated, unsure how to respond. She glanced toward the cafe door, hoping a waiter or someone inside might notice her discomfort. No one did. "I'm just here for coffee," she said finally, her voice low and steady. Greg's smirk widened. "Coffee, huh? Seems like a fancy bag for just a coffee run." The blonde one, Ryan, leaned forward, his elbows on the table as he pointed toward her purse. "Bet she's got all kinds of goodies in there, huh?" Angela instinctively reached for her bag, pulling it closer. "It's just a purse," she said quickly, trying to keep the tension from her voice. "Relax," Ryan said, chuckling as he leaned back again. "We're just curious. No need to get jumpy." The third man, Paul, snickered. "She's acting like we're gonna rob her or something." The comment made Angela's stomach drop. She looked around again, willing someone, anyone, to intervene. But the surrounding tables were occupied by people too absorbed in their own conversations to notice. Greg leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table as his smirk turned into something colder. "You seem nervous, Angela." The way he said her name made her flinch. She hadn't told him her name, but they'd heard it earlier when she ordered her coffee. "I'm not nervous," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Greg chuckled, and his companions joined in. "Sure, you're not." Ryan suddenly reached across the table, tapping her coffee cup. "Still hasn't touched her drink. What's the matter? Not thirsty?" Angela pushed the cup away, her unease growing with every second. Greg sat up straighter, his gaze narrowing. "So, What's in the bag? Nothing important, Angela said, clutching it tighter. That's for me to decide, Greg said casually, reaching out as if to take it. Angela jerked it back. Don't touch my things. Her voice was louder now, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. Greg's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered, leaning back again. Feisty, he said, his tone dripping with mock amusement. I like that, Paul laughed, the sound harsh and grating. She's got some fight in her. Maybe we should stick around. Angela's heart pounded in her chest. Her palms were damp with sweat, but she refused to back down. Leave me alone, she said firmly, her voice shaking despite her resolve. Leave you alone? Greg repeated, raising an eyebrow. We're just getting started. He motioned to Ryan, who stood up and stepped closer, blocking Angela's path to the cafe door. Paul followed suit, positioning himself behind her chair. Angela was boxed in, her breathing quick and shallow. Greg rose slowly, towering over her as he reached out and snatched the purse from her lap. Stop, Angela cried, grabbing at it, but Greg yanked it away with ease. Calm down, he said, laughing as he opened the bag. We're just taking a look. Angela stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete. Give it back. Ryan shoved her shoulder lightly, forcing her back a step. Sit down, sweetheart. You're making a scene. Angela's voice caught in her throat. She looked around desperately, but the other patrons seemed frozen, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. Greg rifled through her purse, pulling out her wallet. Ooh, look at this, he said, tossing it to Ryan. Ryan caught it with one hand, flipping it open. Looks like somebody's doing all right for herself, he said, flashing a grin. Angela felt tears sting her eyes as humiliation and anger warred within her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her instincts told her it would only make things worse. Please, she said, her voice trembling. Take the money and leave. Greg smirked, tossing her purse to Paul, who rummaged through it with a satisfied grunt. Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll be on our way soon enough. He reached for the bracelet on her wrist, and Angela instinctively pulled her arm back. Now, Greg said, his tone turning icy. Don't make me ask twice. Angela hesitated, her hands shaking as she unclasped the bracelet and handed it over. Greg pocketed it with a smug grin. Good girl. He motioned to his friends, and the three began to walk away, laughing and congratulating themselves. Angela sank into her chair, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The patio seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm, the world around her moving on as if nothing had happened. But Angela knew her world wouldn't be the same. Angela sat frozen in her chair, her trembling hands resting on the table. The laughter of the three men echoed in her ears as they strolled away, Greg tossing her bracelet up and catching it like a toy. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear, anger, and humiliation. Angela! The familiar voice snapped her out of her daze. She turned to see her father, James Parker, striding toward her from the cafe entrance. His sharp, commanding presence filled the space around him, and Angela felt a flicker of relief, though it was quickly swallowed by shame. Dad, she whispered, her voice weak. James's eyes swept over her, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he noticed her pale face and trembling hands. What happened? Angela's gaze dropped to the table. They took my purse, my bracelet. James's jaw tightened. His gaze shifted toward the retreating gang. Greg and his friends were now halfway down the sidewalk, their laughter still carrying over the bustle of the street. Stay here, James said firmly. Dad, don't, Angela began, but he was already moving. James crossed the patio in long, deliberate strides. The gang was just turning the corner when his deep voice cut through the air. Hey! The three men stopped and turned, their laughter fading as they saw him approaching. Greg's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Well, look at this, Greg said, his tone dripping with mock amusement. The cavalry's here. James stopped a few feet away from them, his posture calm but commanding. Give back what you took. Greg raised an eyebrow, glancing at his friends. Took? We didn't take anything, old man. Don't lie to me, James said, his voice even but laced with steel. My daughter told me everything. Hand it over. Ryan snickered. Looks like Daddy's here to save the day. Paul crossed his arms, his grin smug. What are you gonna do, Grandpa? Call the cops? James's gaze didn't waver. You've got one chance to do the right thing. Give it back and walk away. Greg stepped forward, his smirk widening. Or what? James didn't move, but his presence seemed to loom larger. You don't want to find out. For a moment, there was silence, the tension thick in the air. A few people nearby had started to notice the confrontation, their murmurs adding to the charged atmosphere. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But see, the thing is, we don't take orders from anyone, especially not from some washed-up old man. He gestured to his friends. Let's go. As they turned to leave, James took a step forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Cowards. The word hung in the air, freezing the men in their tracks. Greg turned back slowly, his smirk now replaced with a hard glare. What did you say? You heard me, James said calmly. You think you're tough? Picking on a woman sitting alone? Stealing from her? That's not tough. That's pathetic. Ryan's expression faltered, but Greg stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. You've got a big mouth for someone who's outnumbered. James's eyes didn't leave Greg's. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. Greg laughed, though it sounded forced. Big talk. You think you're some kind of hero? I think I'm a father, James replied, his voice steady. And I don't let people like you get away with hurting my family. Paul muttered something under his breath, but Greg held up a hand to silence him. His gaze was locked on James, his jaw tight. You've got guts, Greg said again, his tone colder now. But guts only get you so far. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Angela's bracelet, holding it up with a mocking grin. You want this so bad? Come and get it. James didn't move, his eyes narrowing. This is your last chance. Drop it and walk away. Greg tossed the bracelet lightly into the air and caught it, his grin widening. Make me. The standoff had drawn the attention of more onlookers now, the murmurs growing louder. Angela watched from her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the table. James's posture shifted slightly, his body language calm but ready. You really want to test me? Greg took another step forward, his grin now a sneer. I think I do. The tension in the air was electric, the patio falling silent as the confrontation reached its breaking point. The standoff felt like it lasted forever, though it was only seconds. James stood firm, his eyes locked on Greg, while the gang leader smirked, tossing Angela's bracelet lightly from hand to hand. Around them, murmurs from bystanders grew louder, but no one stepped forward. Angela's pulse raced as she watched the scene unfold. Her father's calm, unyielding stance was a stark contrast to the tension crackling in the air. She knew what he was capable of, what years of Navy SEAL training had honed, but she also knew he didn't want to escalate this. She couldn't stay seated any longer. Forcing herself to move, Angela got up and hurried toward them, her voice trembling but determined. Dad, stop, she said, stepping between him and Greg. Her hands went to his chest, trying to physically push him back. It's not worth it. Let them go. James's gaze shifted to her, his expression softening slightly. Angela, they stole from you. They humiliated you. I know, she said, her voice cracking, but this isn't the way. Please. Her eyes pleaded with him, and for a moment, James hesitated. He let out a slow breath, his fists unclenching as he placed a hand on her shoulder. All right, he said quietly. Let's go. Angela exhaled in relief, stepping back to lead him away. But just as they turned, Greg's voice rang out, loud and venomous. Yeah, that's right. Walk away, he sneered. Just like the cowards you people always are. The words cut through the air like a blade. Angela froze, her blood running cold. James stopped mid-step, his shoulders stiffening as he let out a deep sigh. Greg chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. What? Too scared to stand up for your little girl? Figures. Angela's grip on her father's arm tightened. Dad, don't, she whispered, her voice trembling. But James was already turning around. His expression was calm, almost resigned, as though he had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but knew it always would. You just couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you? James said, his tone dangerously even. Greg spread his arms in mock innocence. What? Just telling it like it is? Ryan and Paul exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering as James stepped forward. I gave you every chance to walk away, James said, his voice low and steady. Now, you'll regret not taking it. Greg's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Big talk, old man. Let's see if you can back it up. The fight broke out in an instant. James moved like a coiled spring, his speed and precision catching them off guard. His fist connected with Greg's jaw before the gang leader could react, sending him stumbling backward. Ryan lunged at James from the side, but James sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Ryan's arm and twisting it behind his back. Ryan cried out in pain as James shoved him toward Paul, who barely managed to catch him. Greg recovered quickly, his expression now twisted with anger. He charged at James, swinging wildly, but James ducked under the blow and countered with a swift punch to the gut. Greg doubled over, gasping for air. "Stop him!" Greg barked, his voice hoarse. Paul hesitated, but then rushed forward, throwing a clumsy punch. James caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it hard enough to make Paul yelp and drop to one knee. Angela watched, frozen in a mix of awe and fear. Her father was outnumbered, but he moved with an efficiency that made it clear he was in control. Greg, now furious, pulled something from his pocket, a small knife that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Dad!" Angela screamed, her voice breaking. James's eyes flicked to the knife, his body tensing. Greg lunged at him, but James sidestepped again, grabbing Greg's wrist and slamming it against the edge of a nearby table. The knife clattered to the ground. Ryan scrambled back to his feet, his face twisted in anger. "You're dead, old man!" he shouted, charging at James again. James turned just in time, grabbing Ryan by the front of his shirt and shoving him into Paul, who had also risen. The two men stumbled, but quickly regained their footing, this time moving in unison. Greg, still clutching his side, barked at them. "Take him down!" The fight intensified as Ryan and Paul tried to corner James. Greg joined in, throwing a wild punch that barely missed. James ducked and delivered a punishing kick to Greg's knee, sending him sprawling to the ground. Angela's heart raced as she watched the chaos unfold. Despite their numbers, it was clear the gang wasn't prepared for someone like her father. Greg struggled to his feet again, glaring at James with pure hatred. "You're gonna pay for this," he spat, lunging at him once more. James sidestepped and delivered a precise blow to Greg's ribs, sending him crashing into a nearby table. Paul and Ryan hesitated, their confidence clearly shaken, but they rallied and pressed on. The onlookers gasped as the fight raged on, tables tipping over and chairs scattering. James remained in control, his movements sharp and calculated, but the gang refused to give up. The fight continued to escalate, the gang becoming more desperate with each failed attempt to take James down. The scene was chaos. Tables and chairs were overturned, and the clatter of metal and wood punctuated the escalating brawl. Onlookers edged back, too shocked or fearful to intervene. Angela stood frozen near the edge of the fray, her heart pounding as her father faced off against the three men. James moved with precision, his calm exterior belying the controlled fury in every strike. Greg, nursing his ribs after a punishing blow, gestured for Ryan and Paul to regroup. "Surround him!" Greg barked, his voice sharp with desperation. Ryan and Paul spread out, flanking James, who stood firm in the middle of the patio. His sharp eyes darted between the two men, reading their every move before they made it. Ryan lunged first, swinging a wild punch aimed at James's head. James ducked, pivoting smoothly and catching Ryan's arm. With a swift twist, he wrenched Ryan to the ground, the man crying out as his shoulder hit the pavement. Paul seized the opening and rushed in, throwing a heavy punch. James deflected it with his forearm, the impact reverberating through his arm but leaving him unshaken. He countered with a brutal elbow strike to Paul's jaw, sending him reeling backward into a toppled table. Greg watched, his confidence visibly wavering. "Get up, you idiots!" he shouted, frustration laced in his voice. Ryan struggled to his feet, clutching his arm, while Paul staggered upright, his movements slower now. Despite their clear disadvantage, they moved toward James again, their stubborn pride overriding any sense of self-preservation. Greg, meanwhile, circled to the side, clearly looking for an opening. Angela's eyes darted to him, her stomach sinking as she realized he was reaching for something. A broken chair leg lying amidst the chaos. "Dad! Behind you!" Angela shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. James turned just in time to see Greg swing the chair leg. He raised his arm to block it, the wood splintering against his forearm. The blow stung, but James remained unfazed, grabbing the makeshift weapon and yanking it from Greg's grip. With a swift motion, James snapped the chair leg over his knee, tossing the pieces aside. "You're done," he said, his tone cold and final. Greg backed up a step, his earlier bravado now replaced with uncertainty. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. James didn't reply. His silence was more menacing than any words could have been. Paul and Ryan exchanged glances, their confidence crumbling as James took a step toward Greg. "You've got two choices," James said, his voice steady. "Leave now, or keep going and regret it." Greg sneered, trying to regain control. "We're not scared of you," but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Ryan shifted uneasily. "Maybe we should just go, Greg," he muttered, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "Shut up!" Greg snapped, glaring at him. James took another step forward. "Make your choice," he said, his gaze locked on Greg. Greg's sneer faltered. He looked around, realizing the crowd had grown, all eyes fixed on the scene. His escape routes were narrowing, his options dwindling. But instead of backing down, Greg let out a frustrated yell and charged at James one last time. James sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, delivering a precise kick to Greg's leg that sent him sprawling onto the pavement. Ryan and Paul hesitated for a split second before rushing in together, desperate to turn the tide. James met them head-on. He grabbed Ryan by the front of his shirt and delivered a knee to his midsection, leaving him gasping for air as he collapsed to the ground. Paul swung wildly, but James blocked the blow and countered with a quick jab to Paul's temple, knocking him off balance. Within moments, all three men were on the ground, groaning in pain and clutching their injuries. The patio fell silent, except for the ragged breaths of the defeated gang. James stood over them, his breathing steady, his expression calm but commanding. "You had your chance," James said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. He stepped back, glancing toward Angela. "You okay?" Angela nodded, though her legs felt weak beneath her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky. "But what about—" She didn't finish her sentence. Greg, still lying on the ground, glared up at James with unbridled hatred. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "You're gonna pay for this." James didn't flinch. "We'll see," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the tension, and several people in the crowd stepped back, murmuring among themselves. "Cops are coming," someone whispered. Greg's glare shifted to panic. Ryan and Paul exchanged nervous glances, clearly realizing the consequences of their actions were catching up to them. James turned to Angela. "Stay close to me," he said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. As the sirens grew louder, the gang scrambled to their feet, their expressions a mix of defiance and fear. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, piercing through the tense silence that had settled over the cafe patio. Greg and his crew, still clutching their bruises and battered egos, scrambled to their feet, their earlier bravado replaced by desperation. "We need to get out of here," Ryan hissed, his eyes darting toward the growing crowd and the approaching sound of law enforcement. Paul nodded, wiping blood from his split lip. "Let's go, Greg. This isn't worth it." Greg, still glaring at James, hesitated. His pride burned hotter than the pain radiating from his ribs. "You think this is over?" he growled, his voice low and venomous. "I'll remember this." James didn't respond, his steady gaze locked on Greg. The silence spoke louder than any words, unnerving the gang leader even further. "Greg, come on," Ryan urged, tugging at his arm. With a final hateful glare, Greg spat at the ground near James's feet before turning to flee. Ryan and Paul followed close behind, shoving through the gathering crowd in their haste to escape. James turned to Angela, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Stay here," he said firmly. Her eyes widened in alarm. "Dad, don't—" "They're not getting away with this," James interrupted, his tone calm but resolute. Angela hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew there was no stopping him now. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. James gave her a reassuring nod before turning and jogging after the fleeing men. The chase moved quickly through the city streets, the gang pushing past pedestrians and weaving through traffic in a desperate attempt to disappear. Greg led the way, his movements frantic but determined, his mind racing for an escape plan. "They're not gonna catch us," Greg panted, glancing back over his shoulder. "Just keep moving." Ryan, trailing slightly behind, looked back and cursed. "He's still coming." James followed them at a steady pace, his movements precise and efficient. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Years of training had taught him how to conserve energy, to bide his time until the moment was right. Greg veered into a narrow alley, gesturing for his crew to follow. The walls were lined with dumpsters and shadows, offering the perfect cover. Or so they thought. "Here," Greg hissed, ducking behind a stack of crates. "We'll lose him here." Ryan and Paul collapsed against the wall, their breaths coming in harsh gasps. "You sure?" Paul asked, his voice trembling. "What if he finds us?" Greg sneered. "He won't. The old man's probably already winded." But their smugness was short-lived. James appeared at the mouth of the alley, his silhouette cutting a stark figure against the fading sunlight. He walked forward slowly, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "You picked the wrong alley," James said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Ryan and Paul exchanged panicked glances, their earlier confidence crumbling. Greg stepped forward, trying to mask his fear with bravado. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" Greg snarled. "You should have just let us go." James stopped a few feet away, his posture calm but ready. "And let you do this to someone else?" He shook his head. "Not a chance." Greg's lip curled into a sneer. "You're outnumbered, old man. You really want to do this again?" James's eyes flicked to Ryan and Paul, both of whom were visibly hesitant. "Looks like your backup isn't as eager this time," he said, his tone cutting. "Shut up!" Greg barked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Get him!" Ryan and Paul hesitated for a moment before charging, their movements clumsy and frantic. James sidestepped Ryan's wild swing, delivering a precise strike to his ribs that sent him sprawling to the ground. Paul lunged next, but James blocked his attack and countered with a sharp elbow to the side of his head, leaving him dazed and staggering. Greg watched, his confidence unraveling as James turned his focus to him. "This is your last chance," James said, his voice low and dangerous. "Surrender now, or it gets worse for you." Greg's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "Screw you," he spat, before rushing at James with all the strength he could muster. James moved with practiced ease, dodging Greg's wild attack and countering with a swift combination of strikes. A punch to the gut left Greg gasping for air, and a sweeping kick sent him crashing to the ground. Ryan and Paul groaned from where they lay, neither making any effort to get back up. Greg struggled to his knees, his glare filled with hatred. You don't know who you're messing with," Greg wheezed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. James crouched down, his gaze cold and unflinching. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said. "A coward who preys on the vulnerable." "That ends now." Greg's face twisted in rage, but before he could respond, the sound of sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of police cars illuminating the alley. James stood, stepping back as officers poured into the narrow space. "There they are," James said, motioning to the gang. "They've got stolen property on them and a long list of crimes to answer for." Greg, Ryan, and Paul glared up at him as officers closed in. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the alley in harsh colors, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder as the police closed in. James stood tall, his presence commanding as he motioned to the gang sprawled on the ground. "Stay down," James ordered, his voice firm, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching for any sign of resistance. Ryan groaned, clutching his ribs as he struggled to sit up. Paul leaned against the wall, his breath ragged, but his wide eyes flicked between James and the encroaching officers. Greg, however, had no intention of staying down. His jaw clenched as he pushed himself to his knees, one hand wiping the blood from his mouth. His glare burned with unbridled fury. "This isn't over," Greg muttered, his voice barely audible. James's gaze snapped to him, but Greg's posture gave him away. A slight shift of weight, the subtle coil of muscles preparing to spring. "Don't even think about it," James warned, his voice cold and steady. But Greg thought about it. With a sudden burst of energy, he lunged forward, shoving past James with all his weight. The force caught James slightly off guard, and Greg seized the opportunity to dart toward the alley's other exit. "Stop him!" James barked, turning to pursue. Ryan and Paul, emboldened by Greg's escape, scrambled to their feet. Paul shoved a nearby dumpster toward James, forcing him to sidestep. Ryan followed up by charging at James, his movements clumsy but determined. James reacted instinctively, his Navy SEAL training taking over. He sidestepped Ryan's charge and used the momentum to shove him into the wall. Ryan crumpled with a groan, but the brief scuffle cost James precious seconds. Greg was already halfway down the alley, his movements frantic but quick. "Get back here!" James shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Paul lunged next, desperate to block James's path. James met him with a precise strike to the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground, coughing and gasping for air. By the time James cleared the obstacles, Greg had disappeared around the corner. The police officers finally reached the scene, their voices loud and authoritative as they ordered Ryan and Paul to stay down. One officer looked to James. "Are you all right, sir?" James nodded, his breathing steady but his jaw tight with frustration. "I'm fine. But their leader got away." The officer glanced toward the alley's exit. "We'll set up a perimeter. Can you describe him?" James's expression hardened. "Greg, mid-30s, wiry build, brown hair. He's dangerous and desperate." The officer nodded, speaking into his radio to relay the description. Meanwhile, Ryan and Paul, now cuffed and sitting on the ground, exchanged nervous glances. The fight had drained the last of their bravado, and the reality of their situation began to sink in. James turned his attention to them, his voice low and menacing. "You'd better hope the police find Greg before I do." Ryan's face paled, and he looked away, refusing to meet James's gaze. Paul muttered something under his breath, but his defiance was clearly cracking. Angela appeared at the mouth of the alley, her eyes wide with worry. "Dad!" James turned, his tense posture relaxing slightly as she approached. "I'm fine," he said quickly, reassuring her. Angela's eyes flicked to the two cuffed men, then to the alley where Greg had escaped. "Where's the other one?" James's jaw tightened. "He ran." Angela hesitated, fear and anger warring on her face. "What now?" James glanced at the officers taking Ryan and Paul into custody. "Now, we start tracking him down. He's not getting far." Angela looked uncertain. "You're going after him?" James placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Not alone. The police are involved now, but I'm not letting this go, Angela. Not after what they did." She nodded slowly, her trust in him unwavering despite her lingering fear. The officer who had spoken to James earlier approached again. "We'll take these two in for questioning. If you have any additional information, it'll help us locate their leader." James's gaze shifted to Ryan and Paul. "Don't worry, they'll talk." The officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning back to help his colleagues load the two men into a squad car. As the alley began to clear, Angela touched her father's arm. "What if they don't catch him?" James's expression hardened, his voice quiet but resolute. "Then I will." Angela didn't respond, but the determination in his voice was enough to ease her worries. For now, Greg might have escaped, but James knew one thing for certain: the hunt wasn't over. Hours later, the police station hummed with quiet urgency. James and Angela stood in a small observation room, separated from the interrogation chamber by a pane of reinforced glass. Inside, Ryan and Paul sat slouched in metal chairs, cuffed to the table, their faces bruised and sullen. An officer stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the two men with a sharp, critical eye. Angela stared through the glass, her hands clenched into fists. "What if they don't talk?" she asked, her voice tight with anger and frustration. "They will," James said evenly, his focus never leaving the men in the other room. "They're cowards, and when cowards realize they're alone, they start talking." A detective stepped into the observation room, his notepad in hand, and an air of weariness about him. He nodded at James. "We've started questioning them. They're not saying much yet. Tough guy act. You know how it is." James folded his arms, his expression steely. "Let me in there," the detective frowned. "Sir, I get it. You've got personal stakes here, but this isn't a movie. We've got procedures. Let us handle this." James's voice dropped, firm and unyielding. "Your procedures won't work on them. They need to see the man who put them down, and they need to know I'm not bluffing. I'll get what you need." The detective hesitated, clearly weighing the request. He glanced at Angela, then back to James. "You push too hard, and we lose what little cooperation we have." "I won't push them too hard," James said, though his tone left no room for argument. "I'll get them to talk. You'll get your leads." After a long pause, the detective sighed and gestured toward the door. "Fine, but keep it clean. I'm watching." James nodded and turned toward the interrogation room. The door opened with a faint creak, and James stepped inside. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. Ryan's head snapped up, his jaw tightening when he recognized him. Paul, already nervous, visibly shrank in his chair. "You!" Ryan muttered, his voice dripping with resentment. James closed the door behind him, taking his time as he approached the table. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood tall, his gaze icy as it flicked between the two men. "Me," James said flatly. His voice carried the weight of authority, making the small room feel even smaller. Paul shifted in his chair, his cuffed hands clinking against the metal table. "We already told the cops everything," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "We don't know where Greg went." James tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking on Paul. "Do I look like I believe you?" Paul swallowed hard, glancing at Ryan for support. Ryan sneered, leaning back in his chair. "What do you want from us? We're not snitches." James leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the table. The sharp motion made both men flinch. "You're not snitches. No, you're cowards. Cowards who ran when things got tough and left your leader to fend for himself. How do you think Greg feels about that?" Ryan's face darkened. "Shut up. You don't know anything." "Oh, I know plenty," James shot back, his voice rising. "I know Greg ditched you the second he had a chance. And I know you two are sitting here about to take the fall for everything he's done. So tell me, what's your plan? Protect him? Go to prison for him?" Paul's gaze dropped to the table, his shoulders slumping. "We don't." "Don't even start," James snapped, cutting him off. He stood straight, pacing slowly around the table. "You know exactly where Greg would go. He didn't just disappear. He's got a hideout, a plan. Someone like him always does. And you're going to tell me where." Paul's breathing quickened, and his leg began to bounce nervously under the table. Ryan, however, clenched his fists and glared at James. "We're not scared of you?" he spat. James stopped pacing, turning to face Ryan directly. "You're not scared?" He leaned in, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. "You should be, because you've already seen what I can do. And if you think the cops are going to protect you when Greg finds out you cracked, you're dead wrong." Ryan flinched, but quickly masked it with a sneer. "You think you're so tough, don't you?" James didn't blink. "I don't think." "I know." He straightened, his gaze flicking back to Paul. "Last chance. Talk." Paul's voice cracked as he finally broke. "There's a warehouse," he blurted out, his words tumbling over each other. "East side of town. He's used it before when things got messy." Ryan whipped his head toward Paul, his expression a mix of shock and fury. "What the hell are you doing?" "I'm not going down for him, Ryan," Paul shot back, his voice desperate. "I'm not," James's expression didn't change, but his presence seemed to loom larger. What else? Paul hesitated, then added, there's a bar by the docks. He used to work there. It's quiet. Out of the way. He could be there. Ryan slammed his fists on the table. You're a coward, Paul. You're gonna get us both killed. James leaned closer to Ryan, his voice ice cold. You were already dead the moment you picked the wrong side. Ryan glared at him, but said nothing, his jaw tight with barely concealed rage. James stepped back, turning toward the door. Enjoy your time here. You're going to have plenty of it. As the door closed behind him, Paul slumped in his chair, visibly shaken. Ryan sat rigid, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. James stepped out of the interrogation room, his shoulders set with the kind of rigid tension that comes from unfinished business. Angela was waiting for him in the observation room, her eyes scanning his face anxiously. Did they say anything? She asked quickly. James nodded, his voice measured but firm. A warehouse on the east side. A bar near the docks. It's a start. Angela exhaled, some of the tension leaving her body, but her relief was short-lived, as James's expression darkened. They're holding back, he continued, his voice lowering. There's more they're not saying. Greg wouldn't hole up alone. He's too cocky. If he's got others with him, we're walking into a trap. The detective from earlier walked into the observation room, his notepad in hand. He looked at James with a mixture of respect and apprehension. We've got units ready to check the warehouse and the bar. What do you want to do? James didn't hesitate. Before we make a move, I'm going back in. We need to know if Greg's got backup and how many people he's working with. The detective raised an eyebrow. You already got them to crack once. You really think they'll give up more? They will, James said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Angela touched his arm. Dad, are you sure? They're already riled up. What if they dig their heels in? They won't, James replied, his eyes steady. Greg left them behind, and they know it. It's only a matter of time before they turn on him completely. I just need to push a little harder. The detective sighed, motioning toward the door. All right, but keep it by the book. We're still watching. James gave him a sharp nod and headed back toward the interrogation room. As James stepped into the room, the door closing with a heavy click, the atmosphere immediately shifted. Ryan and Paul both looked up, their earlier defiance replaced with unease. What now? Ryan muttered, slumping further in his chair. James walked to the table and leaned over, his hands flat against the cold metal surface. He didn't say anything at first, letting the silence stretch and weigh on them. Paul fidgeted nervously, his knee bouncing under the table. Ryan, though visibly uncomfortable, tried to maintain a scowl. Here's the thing, James began, his voice calm but laced with steel. You gave me locations. That's a good start. But we both know Greg doesn't like working alone. So, who else is with him? Paul's knee stopped bouncing, and his eyes darted to Ryan, who let out a bitter laugh. Why do you care? Ryan sneered. You think you're gonna play hero and take down his whole operation? James didn't flinch. I care because the next person they target might not walk away as lucky as my daughter. You think this ends here? You think Greg's going to stop because you're sitting in this room? He's already planning his next move, and if we don't stop him, someone else gets hurt. Paul shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing. I told you what I know, he said weakly. The warehouse, the bar. That's all I've got. James turned his attention to Paul, his gaze sharp. You're lying. You know who Greg works with. You've seen them, heard their names. Tell me. Paul swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the table. Ryan scoffed. You're wasting your time. Greg doesn't tell us everything. He doesn't trust anyone. James straightened, his voice rising slightly. Oh, he trusts someone? He wouldn't operate without a safety net. If you want to stay here and protect him, fine. But know this, he won't do the same for you. The second he feels cornered, he'll throw you under the bus, without a second thought. Paul's breathing quickened, his resolve clearly cracking. There's one guy, he said, his voice barely audible. Paul, shut up, Ryan snapped, slamming his fists on the table. No, I'm done, Paul shot back, his voice breaking. You saw how he ran. He left us. You think he cares about what happens to us? James stepped in, his voice calm but commanding. Who's the guy? Paul hesitated, then blurted out, Eddie. He's got connections all over. Greg trusts him with the big stuff, moving stolen goods, finding hideouts. If Greg's got a plan, Eddie's part of it. James nodded slowly. Where do I find Eddie? Paul looked down at his cuffed hands. I don't know exactly, but he hangs around the docks sometimes. He's got a truck, a black one. Always keeps moving, never stays in one spot for long. James turned to Ryan, who was glaring daggers at Paul. Anything to add? Ryan said nothing. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. Thought so, James said, stepping back. You can sit here and stew all you want. Greg's already left you behind, and now you'll be the ones paying for everything he's done. Paul sagged in his chair, while Ryan sat stiffly, his glare boring into the table. As James left the room, the door shutting behind him, Angela looked up expectantly. What did they say? Greg's got a guy named Eddie, James said grimly. If we find Eddie, we find Greg. The night had settled over the city, casting long shadows across the docks. The air was damp and carried the faint scent of salt and oil. James stood near the edge of the water, his eyes scanning the expanse of warehouses and scattered shipping containers. The area was quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing vehicle or the distant creak of a crane. Angela had stayed back at the station, reluctantly agreeing to let her father handle this part alone. James knew she'd wanted to come, but this wasn't the place for her. This was about precision and experience, qualities he'd spent years perfecting. He turned his attention back to the task at hand. Paul's tip about Eddie was all he had to go on, but it was enough. A black truck, always moving, lurking near the docks. James knew that anyone as connected as Eddie wouldn't be hard to find once you started asking the right questions. James approached a small cluster of men standing near a stack of crates, their cigarettes glowing faintly in the dark. They looked up as he neared, their expressions guarded. Hey, James said, his voice steady but firm. I'm looking for Eddie. Black truck. You seen him around? The tallest of the group stepped forward, his gaze narrowing. Who's asking? James didn't miss a beat. Someone who needs to find him. The man chuckled, shaking his head. You're in the wrong place, old man. Move along. James's eyes hardened. I wasn't asking for permission. Is Eddie here or not? The man's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, glancing at his companions. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but before he could finish, James stepped closer, his presence looming. Let me make this simple for you. Either you tell me where he is, or I'll find him myself. But if I do it my way, you're not going to like how it ends. The man hesitated, glancing nervously at his friends. Finally, he sighed, gesturing toward a dimly lit area near a row of shipping containers. Saw him over there about an hour ago. Don't know if he's still around, though. James nodded once, his expression unreadable. Thanks. The area near the shipping containers was quieter, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind and the occasional clatter of metal. James moved carefully, his eyes sweeping the area for any sign of movement. Then he saw it. A black truck parked near the end of the row, its engine idling faintly. James approached slowly, his footsteps silent against the gravel. As he neared, he caught sight of a figure leaning against the side of the truck, smoking a cigarette. The man was tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Eddie, James called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. The man froze, his head snapping up. Who the hell are you? He demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for something in his jacket. James stopped a few feet away, his posture calm but ready. I'm here about Greg. Eddie's eyes narrowed, and he let out a bitter laugh. Greg? What did he do now? You already know, James said flatly. He's in trouble. And so are you if you don't start talking. Where is he? Eddie sneered, tossing his cigarette to the ground. You think I'm just gonna tell you? Get lost. James took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. Greg doesn't care about you. The second things go south, he'll leave you behind just like he did Ryan and Paul. Do you really want to go down for him? Eddie hesitated, his bravado faltering for just a moment. James pressed on. I already have 2 of his guys in custody. They're talking. They gave me your name, so don't waste my time. Eddie cursed under his breath, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Finally he sighed, leaning back against the truck. He's got a spot, Eddie admitted reluctantly. An old warehouse, deeper in the docks. It's not on any map. Just an abandoned place he uses when he needs to lay low. James's gaze didn't waver. How many people does he have with him? 2? Maybe 3, Eddie said, his voice bitter. Hired muscle. But Greg doesn't trust anyone too much. They're just there to keep him safe. James nodded slowly. Where exactly is it? Eddie rattled off an address, his tone resentful. Good choice, James said, his voice cold. Stay out of this, Eddie. You don't want what's coming for Greg. Eddie glared at him but didn't respond. Back at the station, James relayed the information to the detective, who immediately began organizing a team to raid the warehouse. Angela listened intently, her expression a mix of relief and anxiety. You found him? She asked. We've got a location, James confirmed. But this isn't over yet. The detective clapped James on the shoulder. You did good work. We'll hit the warehouse tonight. James nodded, his jaw tight. I'm going with you. Dad, Angela began, but he cut her off with a sharp look. This ends tonight, James said firmly. The team gathered outside the abandoned warehouse in the dead of night, the air thick with tension. The structure loomed ahead, its rusted walls and shattered windows bathed in faint moonlight. It looked like it had been forgotten by the world. But James knew better. This was where Greg was holed up, likely waiting for the chaos to blow over. A detective stood next to James, gesturing toward the tactical team assembled nearby. We're going in silent. We'll breach from 2 sides, sweep the place, and secure the area. James nodded, his eyes fixed on the building. What's the plan if Greg resists? The detective adjusted his vest. We'll handle it. You're here as an observer, remember? James didn't respond, but his clenched jaw made it clear he had no intention of standing idly by if things went south. Angela had stayed back at the station, reluctantly agreeing to let her father handle this part alone. James knew she'd wanted to come, but this wasn't the place for her. This was about precision and experience, qualities he'd spent years perfecting. As the team moved into position, James stayed close to the lead officer, his sharp gaze scanning every shadow and crevice. The building's silence was unsettling, broken only by the faint creaks of its rusted frame. The first breach came swiftly and without warning. A battering ram smashed through the front door, and officers poured inside, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. "Clear the left!" one officer barked, his voice low but urgent. James followed closely, his movements precise and deliberate. His eyes flicked over the dilapidated interior. Piles of debris, overturned crates, and broken machinery cluttered the space. The team moved methodically, room by room. James stayed at the rear, his instincts on high alert. They reached a narrow hallway, where the sound of shuffling feet echoed faintly from the other end. "Hold," the lead officer whispered, raising a fist. The team froze, their weapons trained forward. The faint noise grew louder. Then suddenly, 2 men burst into view, armed with pipes and shouting obscenities. "Contact!" the lead officer barked. The first man swung wildly, his pipe crashing into the wall as an officer dodged. The second charged directly at James, his weapon raised. James stepped aside, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The pipe clattered to the ground, and with a swift strike to the side, James sent him sprawling. The first attacker lunged at the nearest officer, who countered with a well-placed baton strike. He dropped to his knees, clutching his ribs, as the team moved in to restrain him. James turned his attention back to the man on the ground, grabbing him by the collar. "Where's Greg?" he demanded, his voice low and cold. The man glared at him, blood dripping from a split lip. "Go to hell." James tightened his grip, his voice dropping even lower. "Wrong answer. Try again." "Upstairs?" the man finally spat, his defiance cracking under James's unyielding stare. "He's on the top floor. That's all I know." James released him, motioning for the officers to secure both men. "Let's move," James said, his voice steady but urgent. They advanced further into the warehouse, the air growing heavier with each step. The sound of shuffling grew louder again. More men waiting to ambush them. Around the next corner, 3 more figures emerged, their weapons raised. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, charged forward, swinging a heavy chain. James ducked the swing, grabbing the man's arm and using his momentum to slam him into a nearby wall. The chain fell to the ground, and James delivered a quick strike to the man's chest, knocking the wind out of him. The other 2 attackers hesitated, clearly unnerved by the efficiency of James's movements. One of them tried to flee, but an officer tackled him to the ground. The last man stood his ground, brandishing a knife. "You're making a mistake," James said, his voice calm but sharp. "Drop it," the man sneered, lunging forward. James sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until the knife fell. A quick kick to the back of the knee sent the man to the ground, where officers moved in to secure him. James straightened, his breathing steady. "How many more?" he asked the nearest officer. "Unknown," the officer replied, his voice tight. James glanced up toward the top floor, where faint light seeped through the cracks in the walls. He could feel the tension building. Greg was up there, waiting. "Let's finish this," James said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The warehouse had grown eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of machinery in the distance. The team moved in tight formation, their boots echoing in the silence. James's eyes remained locked on the staircase ahead. Every step felt like it brought him closer to the end of this, closer to Greg. The officers had cleared the lower floors, but the top remained a mystery. Greg had already shown how far he'd go to keep control. James knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was, with men like him. As they reached the base of the staircase, James held up a hand to signal the team to stop. His instincts were sharp, and he could feel the pressure building, the silence before the storm. He gestured to the officers to spread out, forming a tight perimeter around the narrow stairs. "Stay tight. We don't know what's waiting up there," James muttered under his breath. The lead officer nodded, and they began their ascent, each step creaking under their weight. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. The top floor was dark, the only light coming from a few broken windows. Dust and debris scattered across the floor, evidence of the place's abandonment. But as James's team moved further in, the faint sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from the shadows. James's pulse quickened. He knew Greg was somewhere close, probably watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Move in," James commanded, his voice low and steady. The officers spread out cautiously, scanning the room. There were crates piled high along the walls, scattered furniture and various broken items, but no sign of Greg. Then, out of the corner of his eye, James spotted movement, a figure slipping between 2 large stacks of crates. His instincts flared, and without hesitation, he moved toward the figure, his body low, eyes narrowed. Greg emerged from the shadows with a crowbar in hand, his eyes wild and filled with rage. His lips curled into a sneer as he swung the crowbar toward James. "You should have stayed out of this," Greg spat, his voice hoarse with fury. "You're just as pathetic as the rest of them." James didn't flinch. He blocked the crowbar's swing with his forearm, the impact reverberating through his body. Greg swung again, faster this time, but James was already moving, sidestepping the blow and countering with a powerful punch to Greg's midsection. Greg staggered but quickly recovered, throwing a wild punch of his own. James ducked under the swing, his body already in motion. With a quick, controlled movement, James grabbed Greg's arm and twisted it behind his back, slamming him into the wall with a sickening thud. "You're done, Greg," James said coldly, his grip tightening. "This is over," Greg gasped, struggling to free himself. But James's strength kept him pinned. The officers moved in quickly, but Greg wasn't ready to give up. With a sudden burst of energy, he kicked off the wall, throwing himself backward and knocking James off balance. The 2 men stumbled, rolling across the floor, but Greg was on top now, his teeth bared in a snarl as he raised the crowbar. "You're not getting away with this," Greg yelled, swinging the crowbar downward. James barely had time to react, raising his arm to block the blow. The crowbar hit with a sharp crack, sending a shock of pain through his arm. But James's grip remained strong. He shoved Greg off, using his momentum to pin him to the ground with a quick knee to the chest. Greg writhed beneath him, his eyes full of fury. "You think you've won? You're just another one of them. Weak and useless." James leaned in closer, his voice cold. "I'm not like you, Greg. I don't hurt people to make myself feel better." Greg laughed bitterly, his breath ragged. "You're wrong. You're just like me. You think you can stop me, but you can't. You don't even know who I am." James tightened his grip on Greg's collar, dragging him up to face him. "I know exactly who you are. A man who hurts others to feel powerful. And that ends now." Greg's eyes flicked toward the officers, who were standing by, watching the struggle. But instead of trying to fight back, he smirked. "You're right. It's over. But don't think this is the last you'll hear of me." Greg spat, his words filled with venom. James stared at him, unblinking. "We'll see about that." With one final move, James twisted Greg's arm behind his back and forced him to the floor, where he held him in place. The officers quickly moved in, cuffing him and lifting him to his feet. As Greg was led away, he turned his head to glare at James. "You'll regret this," he sneered. "I'll make sure of it." James didn't flinch. He stood tall, watching as Greg was taken out of the room. The hunt had ended, but something still gnawed at the back of his mind. There was more to this, more that Greg had hidden. James turned to the officers. "Get him to the car. I want a full sweep of the place. No one leaves until we know everything." The detective, standing off to the side, gave a grim nod. "We'll take care of it." James looked toward the exit. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a moment of relief. Greg's reign was over, and no one else would fall victim to him. The warehouse was quiet now, the air heavy with the aftermath of the struggle. Greg had been subdued, his wrists cuffed tightly behind him as two officers hauled him toward the waiting vehicles outside. James stood motionless in the center of the top floor, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The fight had left a dull ache in his arm, but his focus was elsewhere. The detective approached, his flashlight sweeping the dark corners of the room. "We've got him, Parker. That's what matters." "But something tells me this isn't everything." James nodded, his sharp gaze moving over the scattered crates and makeshift furniture. "Greg's been operating too long to have everything in one place. He's got stashes, connections. There's more here." The detective frowned, motioning for the team to begin a full sweep of the floor. "Let's see what we can find. If he left any loose ends, we'll tie them up." James moved to a corner of the room where a stack of crates was partially covered with a tarp. He pulled the fabric back, revealing an assortment of items: electronics, jewelry, and other valuables. "Stolen goods," James muttered, motioning to the detective. "He's been stockpiling." The detective nodded grimly. "We can match this to the recent robberies. It'll help lock him in." As James continued to search, his foot brushed against something metallic. He crouched down, lifting a rusted panel from the floor to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside were several small notebooks, their pages filled with names, locations, and dollar amounts. "Ledger," James said, holding one up for the detective to see. The detective's eyes widened. "This is big. Names of buyers, accomplices, maybe even clients. Greg's going to have a hard time explaining this." Outside, the air was cool and sharp, a stark contrast to the heat of the warehouse. Greg sat in the back of a squad car, his face a mask of fury. He glared at James as he exited the building, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think this is over, Parker?" Greg shouted, his voice muffled through the car window. "You don't know who you're messing with. I've got people. You'll see." James stepped closer to the car, his expression calm but unyielding. "You've got nothing, Greg. Your people abandoned you the second you went down, and now everything you've done is going to catch up to you." Greg's sneer faltered, but he quickly recovered, laughing bitterly. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a washed-up soldier playing cop. This doesn't change anything. James leaned in, his voice low and steady. You're right. I'm not a hero, but I don't need to be to stop someone like you. Greg's glare burned into him as the officer in the front seat started the car. The vehicle pulled away, its red and blue lights fading into the distance. The detective approached, holding one of the ledgers James had uncovered. This is enough to dismantle his entire operation, he said, flipping through the pages. He's tied to a lot more than just robbery. Human trafficking, arms deals. It's all in here. James's jaw tightened. Make sure every name in that book is held accountable. The detective nodded. We'll put together a task force. This could take months, maybe years to unravel. But you just handed us a starting point. Angela arrived shortly after, her expression a mix of relief and worry as she spotted her father standing near the warehouse entrance. She rushed to him, her arms wrapping tightly around him. Dad, she whispered. You're okay. James returned the embrace, his usually stoic demeanor softening slightly. I'm fine, he said quietly. It's over. Angela pulled back, her eyes searching his. Is it really? What about everything else Greg was involved in? James glanced at the detective, who held up the ledger. We've got the evidence. They'll follow the leads. Angela nodded, though her brow furrowed with lingering concern. And the people he hurt? What about them? James's expression hardened. We'll do what we can, starting with returning what he stole. Over the next few hours, the team cataloged the stolen goods and matched them to open cases. One by one, victims were contacted, their stolen possessions recovered and prepared for return. Each phone call felt like a small victory, a step toward undoing the damage Greg had caused. As dawn broke, James stood outside the warehouse, watching the sun rise over the city. Angela joined him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to him, and he took it with a nod of thanks. As the city began to stir, James allowed himself a moment of peace. Greg's reign of terror was over, and though the work was far from finished, it was a victory worth savoring. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. At the station, Greg's ledgers became the centerpiece of a rapidly growing case. Officers and detectives worked tirelessly, cross-referencing the names and transactions with unsolved crimes and known associates. Each discovery painted a more damning picture of Greg's criminal empire. James sat in a conference room with the lead detective, a map of the city spread across the table in front of them. Pins marked locations tied to Greg's activities. Warehouses, stash houses, and meeting points scattered across town. This is bigger than we thought, the detective said, shaking his head. He wasn't just running robberies. The ledgers tie him to trafficking rings, illegal weapons deals, and even money laundering. This guy had his fingers in everything. James leaned forward, his gaze sharp. What about his men? Ryan? Paul? Eddie? What are they saying? The detective smirked grimly. Ryan and Paul folded almost immediately. They're scared out of their minds and throwing Greg under the bus to save themselves. Eddie's tougher, but even he's starting to crack. They're all trying to make deals, but the DA isn't in a forgiving mood. James's jaw tightened. Don't let them walk away from this. They knew what they were doing. They won't, the detective assured him. We've got enough to put them away for a long time, even without Greg's testimony. James's gaze flicked to the files scattered across the table. Photos of stolen goods, lists of victims, and accounts of crimes Greg's gang had committed. Each piece of evidence was a step closer to justice, but the weight of it all was suffocating. That afternoon, James found himself outside the courthouse. The air was crisp, and the murmur of reporters and onlookers filled the space as Ryan and Paul were escorted from a police van into the building. Their heads were down, their expressions sullen, and their once brash attitudes seemed to have dissolved under the weight of their situation. Angela stood beside James, her arms crossed as she watched them. They don't look so tough now, she said quietly. They're not, James replied, his tone even. They never were. They just thought no one would hold them accountable. Angela looked up at him, her brow furrowed. Do you think they regret it? James's gaze didn't waver. People like them don't regret the harm they cause. They regret getting caught. Angela was quiet for a moment before she asked, "What about Greg?" James's expression darkened. "Greg's worse. He regrets losing control. That's all that matters to him." Inside the courthouse, the trial began in earnest. The prosecution wasted no time presenting its case, starting with a meticulous breakdown of Greg's crimes. Photos of stolen goods recovered from the warehouse were displayed on screens, along with documentation from the ledgers James had uncovered. The prosecutor's voice was steady and deliberate as she addressed the jury. This man built an empire of exploitation. He preyed on the vulnerable, using fear and manipulation to maintain power. But today, the evidence will show that his reign is over. Ryan and Paul were the first to take the stand, their faces pale as they recounted their involvement in Greg's operations. Under the prosecutor's questioning, they described how Greg had recruited them, using promises of quick money and threats to keep them loyal. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his voice shaky. "Greg, he always had a plan. He told us what to do, who to target. If anyone stepped out of line, he made sure they paid for it." Paul nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. We thought it was just robberies at first. But it got worse. The trafficking, the weapons, it was all him. He called the shots." As they spoke, James watched Greg from across the room. The gang leader sat stiffly at the defense table, his expression cold and unflinching. But James could see the tension in his clenched jaw and the way his fingers dug into the arms of his chair. When it was the defense's turn, Greg's lawyer tried to poke holes in the testimony, suggesting that Ryan and Paul were exaggerating to save themselves. But the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. After hours of testimony and evidence presentation, the courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor prepared for her closing argument. She turned to the jury, her voice steady and resolute. "This case isn't just about one man's crimes," she began. "It's about the impact those crimes had on countless lives. Families torn apart, communities left in fear. Greg Daniels and his accomplices thrived on the belief that no one could stop them. But today, we have the power to prove them wrong." As she spoke, James felt a quiet sense of vindication. This wasn't just about Angela or even himself. It was about all the people Greg had hurt, all the lives he had disrupted. The judge adjourned the trial for the day, announcing that sentencing would follow after deliberation. James stood as the courtroom began to empty, his gaze lingering on Greg as officers escorted him out. "He looks like he's losing it," Angela said, watching Greg's stiff posture as he was led away. "He's lost everything that mattered to him," James replied. "Control, power, that's all he cared about." Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he knows it's over?" James's lips pressed into a thin line. "He knows." The courtroom was packed again the next morning, the air heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew this was the moment they had been waiting for. The sentencing. The jury had deliberated late into the night, and now they were ready to deliver their decision. James sat near the back of the room with Angela, his presence calm but alert. He had seen many things in his life, but this was something he wasn't used to. Justice playing out in a controlled, deliberate way. Greg sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his posture stiff. Gone was the smirk he had worn throughout much of the trial. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something, but Greg didn't respond. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." The judge entered, her robes sweeping behind her as she took her seat. She scanned the room, her expression stern. "You may be seated." As everyone settled, the judge began. "This court has reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony presented over the last several days. The crimes committed by the defendant, Greg Daniels, and his accomplices have left a significant mark on this community. It is the duty of this court to ensure that justice is served." The prosecutor stood, her voice steady and firm. "Your Honor, the state requests the maximum sentence for Greg Daniels, given the scope and severity of his crimes. His leadership role in organized theft, human trafficking, and weapons smuggling, coupled with his lack of remorse, warrants no leniency." She gestured toward the victims in the gallery. "These individuals deserve closure. and the defendant deserves the full weight of the law. The judge nodded, then turned to the defense attorney. Does the defense have anything to say before sentencing? Greg's lawyer stood, his tone measured. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the jury's verdict, we ask the court to consider my client's difficult upbringing and the systemic failures that led him down this path. A life sentence without the possibility of parole would be excessive. James felt Angela stiffen beside him. He placed a steady hand on her arm, but his jaw clenched as he listened. Greg Daniels had every opportunity to stop what he was doing. James muttered under his breath. He didn't, because he didn't care about anyone but himself. Angela nodded but said nothing, her gaze fixed on Greg. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the gallery. She leaned forward, her voice firm. This court does not deny the existence of systemic issues. However, it is clear that the defendant, Greg Daniels, actively chose to exploit others for his gain, showing no regard for the lives he ruined. This is not a case of a single bad decision or momentary lapse in judgment. This is a pattern of deliberate, calculated harm. The judge's eyes shifted to Greg. You had chances to walk away, Mr. Daniels. Instead, you built an operation designed to hurt others while enriching yourself. And now, you must face the consequences. She took a deep breath, her next words ringing through the courtroom. Greg Daniels, this court sentences you to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 30 years. A collective murmur rippled through the room, some gasping in relief, others nodding solemnly. Ryan and Paul were sentenced next. Their cooperation with the prosecution had earned them reduced sentences, but the judge made it clear they wouldn't escape justice. Ryan Thomas and Paul Harris, the judge said, her tone severe, your willingness to assist law enforcement is noted. However, this does not excuse your involvement in these crimes. You each played a significant role in carrying out the defendant's plans. She looked at them sharply. This court sentences you both to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 7. Consider this your chance to reflect on the lives you've impacted. James watched as the two men were led out, their heads low. He felt no sympathy for them. They had made their choices, just like Greg. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Angela turned to James. It's done, she said softly. For now, James replied, his tone measured. Angela frowned. What do you mean? James gestured toward the files still being packed up by the prosecution team. There are still names in those ledgers. People Greg worked with. People who profited from his crimes. This was just the first step. Angela nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. And what about the victims? The people who lost everything because of him? We'll do what we can to help, James said. The stolen goods we recovered are already being returned, but some things can't be replaced. That evening, James and Angela returned to the police station one last time. The detective met them at the front desk, his expression tired but satisfied. Greg's not getting out anytime soon, the detective said, handing James a file. We've got teams following the leads in those ledgers. With luck, we'll shut down the rest of his network before they can regroup. James took the file, flipping through the pages. Good. Make sure none of them slip through the cracks. The detective smiled faintly. You can count on it. Thanks for everything, Parker. We couldn't have done this without you. As James and Angela left the station, the cool night air wrapped around them. The city was quiet, its streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Angela looked up at her father. Do you think it's really over? James was quiet for a moment before replying. It's never over. Not completely. But for now, we've done what we can, and that's enough. Angela smiled faintly, her hand slipping into his. Together, they walked into the night, ready to face whatever came next. The house was quiet, the kind of calm that felt heavy after days of tension. Angela sat on the couch, a mug of tea cupped in her hands. The living room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows on the walls. James stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The weight of everything that had happened lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. Finally, Angela broke the silence. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Knowing it's all over. At least for now." James turned from the window, his expression unreadable. He crossed the room and sat in the armchair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Strange isn't the word I'd use," he said, his voice steady but tired. "Necessary, maybe, but not strange." Angela studied his face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "You've done things like this before, haven't you?" James nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "In a way. In the military, it was different. Cleaner, in a sense. Orders, objectives, a clear enemy. This was messy." Angela set her mug down on the coffee table. "Do you think they'll ever understand what they've done? Greg, Ryan, Paul, any of them?" James leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "Some might. Ryan and Paul, maybe. They're cowards, not monsters. They followed Greg because it was easier than standing on their own. But Greg," he shook his head, "Greg doesn't have the capacity for self-reflection. To him, this was just a game he lost. He'll sit in that cell and think about how he can get back at the world, not about the damage he caused." Angela frowned, picking at the edge of her sleeve. "It's so unfair. He gets to live his life, even in prison, while everyone he hurt has to pick up the pieces." James met her eyes, his expression softening. "It is unfair, but that's why we do what we can to make it right. Returning the stolen goods, dismantling his network, it doesn't fix everything, but it's a start." Angela shifted on the couch, tucking her legs under her. "Do you think about the victims? The ones we never met? The ones who didn't even know they were on his radar?" "Every day," James admitted. "People like Greg thrive because they think no one will stop them. That's why it matters so much to stand in their way." Angela looked down, her voice quiet. "You make it sound so simple, like all we have to do is stand up and it'll make a difference." James leaned forward, his tone firm but gentle. "It's not simple, and it's not easy. But it's necessary. You can't change the world overnight, Angela, but you can change it for someone. That's enough." She gave him a small smile, her eyes glistening. "You sound like a superhero, you know." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Hardly. Just someone who refuses to look the other way." For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their conversation settling into something quieter. Angela broke the stillness again. "What happens now?" James rubbed his hands together, the motion slow and deliberate. "Now, we wait. The police have the ledgers. They'll track down the rest of Greg's network. And we help where we can. That's all we can do." "And you?" Angela asked, her gaze steady. "What are you going to do?" James's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I'm going to sit here, finish this tea you made me, and try to remember what it feels like to breathe without carrying the weight of the world." Angela laughed softly, the sound easing the tension in the room. "That sounds like a good plan." James's expression grew more serious. "And you? How are you holding up?" Angela hesitated, then nodded. "I'm okay, I think. It's just a lot. Knowing how close I came to—" She stopped, her voice catching. James reached over, resting a hand on her arm. "You're safe now. That's what matters." "I know," Angela said, her voice steadier now. "But it doesn't feel like enough, you know? I want to do more. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." James nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Then you will. You've already got the most important thing you need. The will to make a difference. Everything else will follow." The clock on the wall ticked softly, the sound blending with the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The world outside seemed peaceful, distant, as if the chaos of the past week had been nothing but a bad dream. Angela picked up her mug again, cradling it in her hands. "Do you think they'll really shut down the rest of his network?" "They will," James said firmly. "It'll take time, but the police know what they're doing. Greg's empire is crumbling, and there's no one left to hold it together." Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Good." James smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "Good." As the night deepened, they sat together, their conversation fading into a comfortable quiet. The fight was over, for now, but both knew there would always be more to do. And that was okay. They would face it together.